The first time I disagreed with my husband out loud, he set his coffee cup down so carefully, so deliberately, that the small click of porcelain against the table felt louder than any shout could have been. I remember the steam still rising off it, untouched. I remember the way he folded his hands and looked at a point on the wall just past my head, like he was giving himself a moment to decide whether I was even worth looking at directly. I was 26. I'd been married for 5 years. And the sentence that caused all of it was barely a sentence at all. I said, "I think you're wrong about this." That was the whole offense. 6 words. Before I walk you through what happened in the days after that and what it cost me, let me tell you who I am. My name is Martha, and this is the channel where I talk about the parts of plain life that nobody hands you a manual for. I grew up old order Amish in a settlement in northern Indiana, and I left that life 8 years ago. If you want to understand what actually happens behind the quiet farmhouses and the black buggies and the soft-spoken hellos at church, hit subscribe, leave a like, and tell me in the comments the smallest sentence you were ever afraid to say to someone who held power over you. I read every single comment. I promise you that. Now let me explain something it took me years of sitting across from a therapist to even find language for, because inside the world I grew up in, nobody ever called it by its real name. In old order theology, a marriage isn't built on the idea of 2 equal people building something together. It's built as a chain of authority, link after link. God sits at the top. Beneath him, the ministry, the bishop, the preachers, the deacons. Beneath them, the husband. Beneath the husband, the wife. Beneath the wife, the children. Nobody hands you a printed copy of this chain. You absorb it the way you absorb the smell of the barn, simply by existing inside it long enough. A wife isn't framed as a partner in that structure. She's framed as a helper. And a helper's entire function by definition is to yield. You learn the posture of yielding long before you ever learn the theology behind it. You watch your mother set the table around your father's schedule. Never her own. You watch the women's side of the church stay several beats quieter than the men's side, even in casual conversation after the service ends. You watch your older cousins get married at 19 and 20 and disappear, almost overnight, into a kind of careful smallness that the whole community calls settling down. By the time you're old enough to be a bride yourself, you don't question any of it, because by then it isn't a rule you're following. It's simply the shape of the air you breathe. So when I tell you I spoke back to my husband, I need you to understand exactly what that phrase means inside that world, because it isn't what you're picturing. It doesn't mean I raised my voice. It doesn't mean I slammed a door, or threw a dish, or said anything even remotely close to cruel. Inside an Amish marriage, speaking back can be as small as a sentence that contains the word wrong, pointed in your husband's direction. It can be disagreeing in a tone that suggests the opinion actually belongs to you, rather than simply repeating his opinion back to him with enthusiasm. That's what I did, on a Thursday evening in late autumn, over a conversation about firewood, of all things. My husband Eli had decided we'd sell off 2 acres of our back timber to a neighboring family for a price I thought was far too low enough that I genuinely believed we were being taken advantage of by men who knew exactly how little say a wife had in these conversations. I'd done the arithmetic myself, quietly, in the evenings, comparing it to what another family 3 farms over had gotten for a similar parcel the year before. When I brought it up, gently at first, he told me the matter was settled and not something that required my opinion. I brought it up a second time, more carefully. He told me a third time, his voice dropping lower and flatter with each repetition, that it wasn't my concern. And on the 4th attempt, I said it. "I think you're wrong about this." The coffee cup went down. The wall behind my head became very interesting to him. And then, in the same calm, even voice he might have used to comment on the weather, he said, "Martha, go on upstairs, sit with yourself a while and think on what you just said to me." I went upstairs. I sat on the edge of our bed, on a quilt my own grandmother had stitched before I was even born, in a small plain room with one window facing the orchard. I want you to actually picture this with me, because the picture is the whole point. A grown woman, 26 years old, a wife, a mother to a toddler asleep down the hall, sent to a bedroom like a disobedient child, because she had used 6 words her husband didn't care for. I could hear him downstairs, finishing his coffee alone, the chair scraping once against the floorboards, the old mantel clock ticking the way it had ticked through 3 generations of that family before it ever became mine. And I understood, sitting there, that this clock had likely watched other women sit on other beds in that very house, thinking the exact same private, furious, unspeakable thoughts I was thinking. Here's the part that people outside a community like this one almost never understand. Eli was not by any honest measure a cruel man. He never struck me. He never raised his voice in the entire time I knew him. By every standard he'd been raised inside, by the example of his own father and his own bishop, he handled that evening exactly the way a godly husband is taught to handle a wife who stepped outside her place. He prayed by himself at the kitchen table. He came upstairs about 40 minutes later, sat beside me on the edge of the bed, and asked quietly if I'd had time to think. I told him yes. He said, "Good," and as far as he was concerned, that closed the matter entirely. But it didn't close anything for me. Because once you've said a true sentence out loud one time, your mouth remembers exactly how it felt to say it. About 2 weeks later, I disagreed with him again, this time over something even smaller: whether our daughter should be allowed to spend a Saturday with my sister's family 2 farms away, a visit he decided against without much explanation. I pushed back, calmly, just once, and this time, instead of sending me upstairs, he put on his hat without another word, walked out to the barn, hitched the horse, and drove off down the lane. I stood at the kitchen window watching the buggy shrink into the distance, and I already knew with a sick certainty exactly where he was headed. I'd seen this exact sequence play out in other households around our district. There was a woman, Anna Yoder, 2 farms south of ours, who'd pushed back when her husband wanted to sell a horse she'd raised and trained herself from a foal. There was Esther King, whose husband told the ministry she'd grown too opinionated after she started borrowing books from a small library in the English town nearby. Each of those women had received a visit not long after. Each visit ended roughly the same way: tears in the kitchen, a husband nodding solemnly in the doorway as the minister left, and a wife who weeks later seemed noticeably quieter at every gathering she attended. I had baked bread for 2 of those households afterward, said nothing, asked nothing. Now it was simply my turn to be on the receiving end of that particular kind of silence from the women who'd once brought bread to me. The bishop's visit came that Sunday afternoon. He arrived alone in his own buggy, in his black coat, with a beard that had gone entirely gray, and a way of looking at you that felt less like eye contact and more like an X-ray searching for whatever guilt you were already half convinced you carried. He sat at my own kitchen table. I poured him coffee with hands I worked very hard to keep from shaking. Eli sat to his right. I sat across from both of them, in my own home, like a guest who'd overstayed her welcome. I want to walk you through exactly what he said, because I have repeated these exact lines to a therapist more times than I could possibly count since then. He asked me whether I believed Scripture taught that a husband held authority over his household. I said yes, because what else does a woman say to a bishop sitting in her own kitchen, drinking her own coffee? He asked me what Scripture instructed a wife to do when she disagreed with that authority. I said, to submit. He asked, gently, almost kindly, whether I had been doing that. I didn't answer right away, and he said, "Martha, your husband tells me you've grown argumentative. He says there's a hardness creeping into you that worries him. This is a serious thing for a wife to let happen. A hardened heart toward a husband is, in Scripture, very often the first sign of a hardened heart toward God himself." I stared at the table. I stared at the cup in front of him. I stared at a woven runner my own mother had made me as a wedding gift, and I felt something rise in my chest that I had no word for at the time, though I have one for it now. The word is fury. Quiet, cold, exact fury, directed at a man I had never invited into my marriage, sitting comfortably in my kitchen, telling me that disagreeing about 2 acres of timber was functionally identical to turning my back on my Creator. But what I said out loud was, "I'll try to do better," because that's the only sentence a woman in that room is ever really permitted to say. And that's the part almost nobody outside this world understands about what Amish husbands are actually permitted to do once a wife has spoken back. They're permitted to send her to sit alone with her thoughts like a child being disciplined. They're permitted to withhold ordinary conversation for days, sometimes longer. A silence we simply called the quiet, where a husband stops answering questions, stops making eye contact, stops acknowledging his wife exists in any meaningful way until she eventually comes to him in tears, asking forgiveness for whatever she's decided she must have done wrong. They're permitted to restrict where she goes, deciding she won't attend her sister's quilting circle this week or won't make her usual Tuesday trip into town. They're permitted to control every dollar that moves through the household, which was already mostly true beforehand, but which sharpens into something closer to a weapon the moment a wife has stepped out of line. They're permitted to bring in the ministry. And in serious enough cases, they're permitted to require a public confession in front of the entire congregation, where a wife kneels at the front of the church and confesses her pride out loud to everyone she's ever known. And here's the piece that took me the longest time to fully sit with. None of that is considered abuse inside that world. Every bit of it is considered correction. Every bit of it is filed away, in the minds of the people doing it, as love. A husband who does these things isn't viewed as harsh. He's viewed as faithful, as taking his God-given responsibility seriously. There was a particular phrase the older women used when a young wife was struggling under this kind of pressure. They'd say, with real warmth in their voices, "Her husband is shaping her." That's what correction was called in our world. Shaping. And if a woman didn't feel grateful for being shaped, that itself was treated as further proof of exactly how much shaping she still needed. I want to be fair here, because fairness matters to me even now. There were husbands inside that same community who never did any of this. My own Uncle Joseph was married to my Aunt Frida for nearly 40 years, and I never once witnessed him send her anywhere, or freeze her out with silence, or threaten her with a visit from the ministry. They disagreed plenty, quietly, at their own kitchen table, and worked it out as equals, in their own private way. The system permitted control. It didn't require it. There were good men inside that structure who simply chose, every day, not to use the power they'd been handed. I won't pretend otherwise. But the permission itself was always the danger. It sat in the corner of every single marriage, whether it was ever used or not, waiting for the moment a wife happened to say the wrong 6 words at the wrong kitchen table. After the bishop's visit, I went almost a year and a half without disagreeing with Eli about anything at all, out loud, in any form he could clearly point to. I got remarkably good at swallowing sentences whole before they ever reached my mouth. I learned to nod at things I didn't believe. I learned to smile through frustration so convincingly that even I started to half believe it. I learned to say, whatever you think is best, in a tone warm enough that nobody, including me some days, could tell it was a surrender rather than genuine agreement. From the outside, I became, by every measure the community used, a model wife. The older women began complimenting me at gatherings, saying marriage had finally softened me, that I'd settled into myself. None of them understood that what they were calling softness was actually the slow, careful disappearance of an entire person. The turning point came on an ordinary spring morning that I still can't fully explain, even now. I was out hanging quilts on the line behind the house, nothing unusual about the day at all, and I found myself staring at the long row of Eli's shirts snapping in the wind, and a single thought arrived in my mind with no drama attached to it whatsoever. I cannot do this for another 30 years. That was the whole thought. Quiet, plain, absolutely certain. It took almost 3 more years, after that morning, before I actually walked out the door for good. I left with my 2 children and 1 suitcase, with help from a woman outside the community whose name I still won't say publicly, because she remains there and would face real consequences for what she did for me. The shunning that followed was swift and complete. Letters from my parents stopped arriving within weeks. My own sister stopped answering the phone. The same households I'd once brought bread to after their own difficult visits from the ministry never once brought anything to me. In therapy, years afterward, my therapist asked me to identify the exact moment I knew the marriage was truly over. I expected myself to say the bishop's visit, or the long stretches of silence that sometimes lasted a week or more. Instead, what came out of my mouth was the coffee cup, the careful click of it against the table, the wall behind my own head suddenly becoming more interesting to him than I was. Because that was the precise moment I understood I'd been living my entire adult life inside a country where 6 honest words could cost a woman everything she had, and that nobody had ever once told me the rules of that country before I became a citizen of it. My therapist said something to me that day I've carried with me ever since. She said, "Martha, in a relationship where only one person is permitted to be wrong, what you have isn't a marriage, it's a sentence." I've thought about that sentence of hers nearly every day since she said it. I don't hate the world I came from. I want to say that plainly, because it's true. That community showed up for every birth, every harvest, every funeral, without exception. It gave me a work ethic that has carried me through every hard season since. It even gave me a version of faith that slowly, on my own terms, I've managed to rebuild into something I can actually live inside honestly. But there's no scripture I've ever read, In any translation, that requires a grown woman to sit alone on the edge of a bed, reflecting on 6 words she said about firewood. There's no God I believe in now, who built a woman with a fully working mind, and then demanded, as the price of love, that she spend her whole life pretending she didn't have one. If you grew up somewhere your opinion got labeled pride, and your disagreement got labeled sin, I see you. If you've ever swallowed a true sentence so many times in a row that you genuinely forgot what your own voice sounded like, I see you too. If you're still inside a marriage, a family, or a church right now where speaking honestly cost you more than staying quiet ever would, I'm not here to tell you what to do with that. I'm only telling you that I lived inside it for years, and that on the other side of it, there's a woman who can finish her own sentences again, out loud, without flinching. Tell me in the comments what part of this stayed with you tonight. Tell me if you've ever sat with your own version of that coffee cup moment, the small instant you realized exactly how much a few honest words could cost you. Tell me where you're watching from. I read every single comment that comes through. And if you want more honest stories from inside this world, subscribe and stay close, because there's a great deal more I haven't said yet. Until next time, choose your freedoms with care. Sometimes that choice is the very thing that ends up saving you.